Okay.
And that is not a bathtub on the cover, it's the world. Because the world is Matthew's bathtub. Matthew Felix is not a luxury traveler, but even traveling on a budget fails to explain why he has so many unforgettable experiences on the toilet, in the tub, and under the shower. From Matthew's unorthodox bathing practices in Paris and Istanbul, to his nightmare while squatting in Morocco, to the Dead Sea shower incident that led to an arrest, Porcelain Travels is sometimes hilarious, occasionally shocking, and always entertaining. Matthew is an author, podcast producer, a host, and a traveler. Adventure, humor, and spirituality infuse his work, which often draws on his time living in Spain, France, and Turkey, as well as his travels in over 50 countries. Matthew's debut novel, A Voice Beyond Reason, is the story of how a young Spaniard's awakening to his intuition gets him out of his head so that he can follow his heart. Matthew's travel story collection, With Open Arms, recounts his humorous and harrowing experiences on 2 trips to Morocco. His video podcast, Matthew Felix on Air, features guests discussing writing, travel, culture, and more. I was a guest last night. It's quite an experience to be in a podcast with Matthew. And it's an adventure. You don't have to go far for that. He has produced 3 more podcasts based on his books. In his free times, you'll find him exploring, whether it's the streets of San Francisco or someplace else in the world. But tonight we're really excited because we're celebrating Porcelain Travels. And I think Matthew's around here. Oh, Matthew, here he is. Matthew Felix.
Thank you for that beautiful introduction. It almost sounded as if I had written some of that. So first of all, apologies for the technical issues. And what are you laughing at? And we were going to have a video. We will not be having a video because the projector's not working. I did come in twice this week to make sure. And Kristen has just done her damnedest to figure it out. So the good news is, we have plenty of other stuff to talk about. And I think I actually am going to show a little bit just from my laptop because I feel like you might actually be able to see it. Okay, so let me just
We're happy
do
with
this.
Just you, Matthew.
You're happy with just me? Oh, that's so touching. All right, hold on. I'm still going to do this. I know it's not just one thing. I just have to send an email.
Don't tell us your password. Wait, I forgot my 90.
You forgot my Come on in. The right place. All right, so now we can start because Diane has arrived. And of course, she has arrived in style. And she just shocked me, which is not surprising. She shocked a lot of men over the years. Okay. And still trying, she says. Okay. Thank you again for coming, in all sincerity. And, hey, yeah, we started? You guys did. Okay. I'm looking forward to a great evening, but there is something that I just want to acknowledge because, like I said, hopefully we are going to have fun here tonight, but we have fires up north, we have fires down south, and so I just want to take a second to acknowledge those. I want to acknowledge the people who have been affected. Many of us probably have. The people, of course, who have lost their homes and even their lives, and the people who are working to make sure that we can contain these things as soon as possible. So I just wanted to acknowledge those people before we went too far. So thank you. Most of you already know me, several of you do not, so thanks to all of you for coming out. Linda already covered most of this, but I have my novel, A Voice Beyond Reason, which I won't go into too much since she's already covered that. My Morocco book, With Open Arms, Short Stories of Misadventures in Morocco, that we will be having an event with Erin at the Corte Madera Book Passage in December on Friday, December 12th. So, sorry, I keep thinking 12/7. So yeah, come out on the 12th. The event will be over, but you're welcome to come out. Okay. So today, of course, like I said, we're here to talk about, or like Linda said, we're here to talk about my new book, Porcelain Travels, Humor, Horror, and Revelation in, on, and around toilets, tubs, and showers. Now, Linda, if you could stop. So she was on my podcast yesterday, as she mentioned, and if you only watch the first 5 minutes of the podcast, it's worth it. The part where she's burping into the microphone and just completely derailed things. This, Bay Area literary icon who I couldn't even get into the interview with because she couldn't stop burping. Okay, Porcelain Travels, in all seriousness, is not a book I ever intended to write. And actually, I resisted writing this book for a long time. But when I was preparing for today, I did find some evidence that I actually have had a sort of special relationship with the bathroom since very early on, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to show. I don't know if you can see that. But, so that's from very early on. I already had this intense relationship with the bathroom, with the toilet, and so I think that maybe I was in fact predestined to write this book.
Is that you?
That's me. Yeah, that's me. No, I just found a cute baby picture online and thought I'd show it today. So afterwards, you can rotate past the picture and see me when I don't know how old I would have been there. I haven't changed a bit. I have the biggest egghead as a child. That's the only thing. Okay. But this particular book I wrote, oh, Tanya needs a picture of me. I could send you the picture. You don't really need, wow. It's almost as if we're not doing a live event. Diane needs a shot. Okay, live. Okay, Lowry's got a shot. Okay. In all seriousness, I never intended to write this book. What happened was I was in the south of Spain. I was working on my novel, and I had been traveling for a few months before I got to the south of Spain, Andalusia. And I just wrote a few stories. I was just getting into writing. And so I wrote a few stories about some funny, quirky experiences that have happened to me in bathrooms, both when I was traveling and when I was living in different places abroad. And I sent them to some family and friends, I shared them, and then just kind of never thought about them. Didn't just, let them go, because again, it wasn't really a project, it was just me playing around experimenting. I wrote my novel, published my novel, I wrote my Morocco book, published my Morocco book, and that was a 10-year span. Well, 10 years later, after I published both of those books, I was in the Midwest for the holidays, and friends and family, a couple different members of friends and family said, okay, you've published those 2 books. When are you publishing your bathroom stories, as they started informally calling them? And I just sort of thought, or responded, I'm not publishing those stories. Those aren't stories I ever wrote with that in mind, and I just sort of let it go. Well, then the next year I went home for the holidays, and again I got the same question. So when are you publishing those bathroom stories? And I thought, okay, wait a second. If people are still talking about these stories, and they're still laughing about these stories, when I'm not even bringing them up, I need to hear that. Something resonated. And rather than be dismissive, because I didn't necessarily want to be known as the guy who wrote the bathroom book, maybe that was an opportunity, and I needed to hear that. So I came back to San Francisco, and I dug up those old stories, and to be honest, I still didn't think they were that funny. But in the 10 years that had elapsed since I had written the originals, I had worked with a brilliant editor, I had worked with some really ruthless beta readers. I had started a writing group and started to get feedback from my fellow writers and beta readers. Chuck is a ruthless beta reader. If anyone needs one, he's amazing. And ruthless being the key word here, but point being, I had honed my craft. And so, looking at the stories now, even though I didn't think they were up to snuff necessarily to share with the world, I thought that I saw how I could make them good enough for me to feel comfortable, publishing them. So I started working on that. Well, in the meantime, again, 10 years had passed. Well, I continued traveling the same way I always travel, which again is not, I don't spend a lot of time in 5-star hotels. I'd rather have the time than the actual, experience someplace. So I had unintentionally, just over time, naturally amassed a whole bunch more of these experiences that were along the lines of the original experiences. And so, taking the original stories I was working on, I started writing the second collection of stories, and soon I realized that I actually had a whole book. The book is 70,000 words. It's twice what my Morocco book is. It's the size of my novel. And so I started writing those stories. Well, as I got to the end, or towards the end of writing that second group of stories and finishing editing the first group, Linda and I met at Book Passage Travel Writers Conference, and she was starting a new workshop, and so she reached out to me and said, hey, would you like to be part of my workshop that's getting ready to start? Well, the timing was perfect, and I already knew that she was amazing from hearing so many other writers, just laud her and say great things about her, so I jumped at that opportunity, and that really picked things up. It forced me to get to the end of the stories I was working on and editing, and really get them to the next level, and get them to where I thought, they needed to be. What's next? Okay, so now is the point. Now is the point where I was going to show a video, and I want to see how the video looks. And I'm not going to show the whole 7 minutes. So basically, what the video was or is some of you will have seen it. So I did a podcast, my video podcast episode dedicated to the book, where I was sort of officially introducing the book 2 weeks ago. And I had a 15-minute video that goes through chapter by chapter, just very briefly. And what I did for today, Chuck's yawning, so I'm sorry if I'm going on too long. What I did for today is I took that 15-minute video and I just made it much quicker just to give people a sense. And so I'm not going to show the whole video, I'm just going to see how it works. It's adorable, Diane's saying.
I can see it from back. I think
Can you see it? Kristen says she can see it.
Yeah.
Okay. But I don't know about the volume. You might not be able to hear it, so we'll just play a little bit.
Put the microphone by the
Oh, that's true.
speaker.
Okay, let's see. So one thing I wanted to do on today's show was give you a story-by-story overview or introduction to my new book, Porcelain Travels. And I thought there'd be no better place, obviously, to do that than right here in the bathtub, given the subject matter of the book. So the first story is called It Ain't Over. And this is a story that could have been included in my Morocco book, Short Stories of Misadventures in Morocco, with Open Arms, Short Stories of Misadventures in Morocco. But at the time I wasn't sure that I didn't know if I really wanted to go there. And I subsequently realized with regards to the subject matter what actually happens in this story. But then I subsequently realized that I could treat this story in a literary fashion and go there while still sort of maintaining a certain level of, I don't know, not decency, but in a way that would be palatable to most people. And I even had my mom read this story and she was fine with it, so I think I did an okay job with that. But basically the story entails, or it's the rest of the story from my first arrival in Tangier, Morocco. And I had a horrible arrival, I was harassed, there was all sorts of just horrible things that happened to me my first night in Tangier. And I get to the hotel and I'm thinking that everything is done and that I've made it. And it turns out that there's one more sort of pseudo-cultural experience that awaits me. And so, again, the title of that one is It Ain't Over. The Bin and the Bomb is sort of a collection of stories within the overall collection that is Porcelain Travel. It's about 8,000 words. And so, like I said, it's a bunch of little stories that all take place during my time staying in these servants' quarters in Paris. And the bathing situation was bizarre. Everything about this place was bizarre. The bathing situation, but a lot of other things as well. So this is a collection, like I said, of several stories about my experiences when I was living in this really strange living situation. No Stopping is a story that is sort of in line with what you might expect from this collection, in the sense that it really is about biological processes, as the title might suggest. And basically, I was in Eastern Europe, and I had to go to the bathroom really, really badly. And as I was going to the bathroom, I realized that all was not what it seemed. And that's all I'm going to tell you about that one. Barely Breathing is, what's Barely Breathing? Oh yeah, Barely Breathing is another story that takes place in Paris. And I had just flown, from San Francisco to Paris, and I was at my friend's place, and she wasn't there yet. And again, having just flown halfway around the world, I had to go to the bathroom. So I go to the bathroom, and this is one of the several stories that sort of allude to or touch on the humor and the just oddity that can come from cultural differences in bathrooms when we're traveling. Freshly Squeezed is a story that happens right after the previous story. I left Paris and went to visit a friend in Copenhagen. And again, after the trip from Paris to Copenhagen, I was feeling just, really greasy and exhausted, and I just really needed a shower. And so this story is about, my friend ushers me to his shower, to his bathroom, and I go inside, and it's just a minuscule room. It's almost like a little closet. and I'm there to take a shower, and I look around, and there's no shower. And so this story is about how I sort of negotiate that and how I figure out how to actually bathe and how to take a shower in a room where ostensibly there is no shower. And then there's some other things that follow. Once I figure that out, there's some other things that follow in that very peculiar bathroom. Double Duty, this is a story that takes place in Malta, which is someplace that I had wanted to visit for a long time. And again, I had just flown halfway around the world. I went to bed early. I wanted to get on their schedule so I didn't have to deal with serious jet lag. But I was awoken at 5 a.m. And I wasn't awoken because of jet lag. I was awoken because of something taking place outside my apartment. And so double duty is how I come up with a sort of creative solution so that I can keep sleeping. Between my legs, so this is an example. This is a story, actually, it's two separate stories that I included together because they take place chronologically at the same time and in the same place in Barcelona. One has to do with some weird situations in the bathroom where I was staying when I was in Barcelona. But then the other is a story that just happens at the same time in the same place, and it was too good a story not to include in the collection. So I do that a few times in Porcelain Travels. I include stories that are sort of, I felt, too good not to include, that don't specifically relate to toilets, tubs, or showers, but they're somehow related, maybe it's just in time and space, to ones in the collection that do. A Day at the Beach. Now this story recounts one of the strangest days of my life, one of the most unforgettable days of my life. And it's sort of a funny story in parts. In others, it's kind of almost a little dark. I mean, it's a little difficult to describe. But basically, I was visiting a friend, and she had a boyfriend, and then there was another friend from San Francisco, so there were four of us. And A Day at the Beach refers to, we went to the Dead Sea. And we were in the West Bank, having a nice day, doing the whole mud thing. And things went really, really wrong. And I think that's all I'm going to tell you about that one. But I love that story. Falling to Pieces is when I was living in southern Spain. And I was writing my novel, Avoid Beyond Reason, and I was staying in this really quirky, like so many of the places I stayed, this very quirky place that had originally been a stable for animals. And the owners, the current owners, had converted it to just this little minuscule studio. So part of the story is about the weird space in the bathroom that was built around this massive boulder to start it. But then I also wasn't the only one using the bathroom, and so this story talks about some of the other residents in this little place where I was staying. And then there's also a flashback to a similar experience that happened to me in Palm Springs. And that's another thing that I do somewhat, or not somewhat, but occasionally in this book, is stories that are taking place while I'm overseas or in a particular place, often remind me of something that happened elsewhere. And so there are quite a few sort of flashbacks where I tell little stories within the slightly larger story. So that's something that happens in Falling to Pieces. Rearview Mirror is a story that actually happened here in the United States. It happened in Arizona. I was with a friend, and we were visiting a friend in Tucson. Our rental was in their driveway, and they needed to pull their car into the garage. So as I went to back out our car, all of a sudden there was all these shouts, stop, stop, don't move the car, don't move the car. But I couldn't see what was happening. So I'm looking in the rearview mirror, hence the title of the story. And I don't learn what happens until afterwards, and it was pretty funny. My Lost Soul is another story that takes place in Barcelona. I spend a fair amount of time in Barcelona. I do like to do a lot of writing there, and I have a particular place that I like to go. And again, this is another really bizarre, minuscule studio, but I love it. It's got 360-degree views of the city, of the mountains, and of the Mediterranean. But it's also a seven-story walk-up, and has lots of other really, really strange sort of qualities. So half of this story is about just the space itself, because the space itself merits its own story. But then, of course, something happens while I'm staying in this space that's the second half. A Turkish Bath in Morocco is one of two stories that is actually already in that I first published in my Morocco book, With Open Arms, Short Stories of Misadventures in Morocco. But I just had to include it in this book because a Turkish bath, it goes so perfectly with the themes and with the other stories in Porcelain Travels. And anecdotally, it just also seems to be one of the favorite stories with readers from that collection. So I don't know that I need to explain more than that. A Turkish Bath in Morocco, I guess I'll just say that it's one of those experiences that in hindsight is pretty funny, but while I was living it, it was not funny at all.
Strangers in the night. This was just a really strange night that I had when I was traveling with a friend in Paris. This particular night, we both decided to do our own thing. I went out, she went out, we did our own thing. I came home before she did, and I went to bed. Well, hours after I had already gone to sleep, someone barges into my room. And of course, I'm not expecting this. I'm jolted awake. I don't know if it's a thief, if it's, if I'm under some sort of threat.
And so Strangers in the Night is about that episode, but then it's also about a flashback to a hilarious thing that happened when a Parisian friend was visiting me here in San Francisco. And then it also just has this really sort of over-the-top ending. So that's Strangers in the Night. A Real Shortage is a story about when I was living in Istanbul, Turkey. And this isn't necessarily that funny. I think it's entertaining. I hope it's entertaining.
It's really, again, sort of focused on the cultural aspects, the cultural experiences that we can have sometimes, specifically related, in this case, to water, a real shortage of water. I was living in Istanbul, and I was living in the center in a really old neighborhood, in a really old building, and we only got water every few days, or every 2 or 3 days, depending. And so this is just some anecdotes about how we dealt with that and how the landlady dealt with that. And then my experiences, of course, never having dealt with that sort of situation before, just kind of how I did and some of the things that resulted. A Dire Miscalculation. This is another story that, as the title suggests, is in line pretty directly with what you might expect Porcelain Travels to be about. And what I mean by that, again, is I am talking very explicitly here, although again, sort of not in an off-color way, but I am talking explicitly about a biological process and a very grave mistake that I made while traveling on a boat on the Nile.
And that was one that I really had to swallow my pride to write. So again, A Dire Miscalculation in Egypt. You Called Me a Girl is a story that I wrote
here again in California this time, in Tamales Bay, a couple hours north of San Francisco. And I'm not sure what to tell you about this one, other than there was some violence, a bit of an assault that resulted from a misunderstanding related to the bathroom. And I think that's kind of all I can tell you about that one. Really bizarre 24 hours. So that's You Called Me a Girl. Identity Crisis. This is about, anyone I think who's traveled to Europe.
So many tubs/showers in Europe don't have shower curtains. And I've lived there several times. I've spent a lot of time traveling in Europe, and I've never understood it. And it just annoys me. I don't understand why they just don't buy shower curtains. So this is just a short story that takes place in Valencia, Spain, where I sort of recount my experience trying to shower without a shower curtain.
Now You See It is just a really quick story. It's only about 800 words, but it's about a shower that I encountered in Oslo, Norway, not too long ago. And it was in this minuscule bathroom. The apartment wasn't so small, but for whatever reason, the bathroom was minuscule. And so the owner of the apartment had installed this shower that just made it was an ingenious use of space. And so, like I said, really short story, 800 words, but it fit really well, again, with the other stories in this book. Watching You. This is another pretty short story, and it's from, again, California. I was camping on what's called the Lost Coast.
And one morning I woke up, it was gray, it was misty, it was kind of foggy, and my friends were still asleep, but I had to go to the bathroom. So I went to the beach, on the edge of the beach, and started to do my business, thinking I was completely alone. Well, it turns out I wasn't alone. And so this story is about the interaction that I had as I'm doing my business early that morning. Out in the Cold is one of my favorite stories. This is from when I was an exchange student in Spain, and my friend was also an exchange student in Finland at the time, in high school. And so once school wrapped up, I decided to go see my friend in Helsinki. Well, I got to the Nordic countries earlier than expected.
So I decided to take the long way and go up through Norway, come across Sweden, and back down to Finland that way. Well, not having expected to go to the Arctic Circle, I wasn't prepared to go to the Arctic Circle, and I really found myself in a bind when it turned out there were no trains and no hotels, and I was sort of stuck in the Arctic Circle. And so Out in the Cold is about how I dealt with that little predicament.
The Dunes is the second story from my With Open Arms Morocco book, And it's another one that just deals so specifically with the subject matter dealt with in the other stories of Porcelain Travel that I had included. And it's also one of my favorite stories about, there were 4 of us and we were making our foray out into the Sahara sand dunes. And some things didn't go quite right for one of the guys that was with us. Rising sign, I'm Scorpio rising, that's an allusion to that. And this story is the second one that takes place in Malta. And there's also another flashback story here that takes place in Turkey. It's actually a shorter but a more intense story. So that's Rising Sign.
No Refuge. This is another really long story. This is another one sort of like the Bin in the Bomb that I mentioned is the second story. This is really sort of a collection of stories. And I was living in Paris, or living in France. I was in Paris at the time, but I was running out of money. But I was getting a lot of writing done, and I wasn't ready to come back home. And so I needed to get creative, and I needed to find sort of a situation that would allow me to still be overseas, still be in France, but not spend a lot of money. And so I found this work-trade situation. Well, as it turns out, this was not a refuge. This was not an equitable sort of trade, and it actually ended up being a really bad situation. As it turns out,
I was able to find online some information about what happened to people who had been at this place after me. And crazy, just really crazy. Let It Flow, this is the second to the last story.
But this is a story that, again, does deal with biological processes, and it's sort of the opposite of my previous story that deals with them in the sense that I'm on a bus in Turkey, and I've really, really got to go, but the bus is not stopping. And so the story is about, again, how I sort of deal with that.
Finally, last but again not least, Grin and Bury It. This is, I was staying for 3 months on the Spanish island of Mallorca.
It's about a bit of a crisis in this house where I'm staying. Well, the story then is about how I deal with the crisis, but then once I've dealt with the crisis, I'm still left in a bind.
And so the story is about how I deal with the crisis, but then how I also deal with the bind that this crisis leaves me in. So, that is my off-the-cuff, impromptu attempt to describe each of the 25 stories in my new book, Porcelain Travels. And my hand is killing me. No, but hopefully that was worthwhile. And thank you for bearing with the technical issues there. Okay, so now we're going to go old school, and I'm actually going to read a few things from the paperback. And hello, Matthew. And just a few things. So like I said, some of the stories you might assume have to deal with physiological processes, and some of them do, but most of them do not. And even when they do, I try to do it in a literary fashion because I don't really think, lowbrow humor, I think it's too easy, and I don't actually usually think it's that funny. So I tried to treat it, even when I did talk about physiological processes, in a sort of literary way. And this will help you. You can't picture that? Well, I'm going to help you picture that right now. So this story is from, what's this one from? This one is from, I don't know, I'll see it. I have it marked as 1, so I'll remember what
There's a stand. There's a stand there. Oh,
There's a stand right there.
Oh, for the mic. Oh, awesome. Because I like to talk with my hands, and it's really hard. Oh, God. I've already had my camera go, actually, Lowry, I think you're blocking my video camera, by the way.
Oh.
It's okay, it's a night of technical gas. Welcome, Nahid. Thank you for joining us. All right, so this story is, I referenced them all in the video, obviously. Hold on. All right, here we go. Okay, so this one is, it's called A Dire Miscalculation. And of course, I'm just going to read an excerpt. I had rescued Sonny in the Cairo airport. A tall, lanky, blonde and blue-eyed Australian. Like me at the time, he was in his mid-20s. Unlike me, he didn't have 6 months under his belt living on the mean streets of a semi-developing country. He lacked my experience dealing with belligerent, pestering touts. Like hyenas sensing a kill, a mob had surrounded him, recognizing a perfect victim to drag to the hotel or store or wherever else would reward them with a handsome bounty for his head. Without giving it a second thought, I broke through the chaos, grabbed Sonny by the hand, and took him with me to a cab. Shell-shocked and grateful, he offered no resistance. That was a week earlier. We'd been traveling together ever since. Making our way south, we had arrived in Luxor. Although tempted to go all the way to Aswan, we opted instead to catch a felucca. Is someone trying to get in? Is that Diane again? Oh no, it's a trash can. All right. Making our way south, we had arrived in Luxor. Although tempted to go all the way to Aswan, we opted instead to catch a felucca, a wooden sailboat traditionally used on the Nile, to head back north. Now we were sailing on the Nile, the same Nile we'd heard so much about as children in Sunday school. The mythic river that had sustained an entire nation, not to mention ancient civilizations before it, turning sandy desert shores into fertile countryside. A river bordered by celebrated pyramids, temples, and tombs, inhabited by crocodiles almost as legendary. A river that even now, from our perspective in the middle of it, seemed to flow through a time and place all its own. The shores were often covered with lush vegetation, grasses, bushes, and small trees crowding each other for access to the water. In other places, there was nothing but sand. Sometimes there were flat fields, sometimes steep mountains. Towering palms were common, entire stands of them occasionally sheltering dwellings made of adobe. Again, I was reminded of biblical times. As far as I could tell, the simple earthen structures were built in the same manner as they had been for millennia. The same might have been said for our felucca. For all its charm, it did not have a toilet. We, therefore, did not have a choice. If we had to go, we had to stop. Besides being ecologically irresponsible, defecating over the side of the boat would have been challenging at best, dangerous at worst. It was also likely to seriously piss off some crocodiles. Under ordinary circumstances, we could have gone several hours without relieving ourselves. As is so often the case when traveling, however, these were not ordinary conditions. Upon my arrival in Turkey, many months earlier, I had suffered through 16 days of diarrhea. It hadn't been pretty, exactly. The upside was that I now had a gut made of steel. Or almost. Apparently Egypt had introduced some new microbes into my system, and while not as vicious as those I had encountered in Turkey, they had nonetheless loosened things up. Limited vegetarian options on the road hadn't helped, particularly given that one of my dietary staples was figs. On the boat, we were practically living on them. Fresh, healthy, high-fiber figs. It was sort of like binging on laxatives when we should have been guzzling Imodium. Neither Sunny nor I wanted to be responsible for asking our hosts to pull over. After all, pulling over a sailboat on a river that's an average of 2 miles wide is a little more involved than pulling a car over to the side of the road. We were in the middle of nowhere. We couldn't just stop at the nearest dock. They were few and far between. An unspoken high-stakes brinkmanship ensued. Sunny and I each worked hard to disregard our respective needs in the hopes the others would become unbearable first. Sweat soon covered my brow. It wasn't the desert heat. It was evidence of my silent suffering. It was the fear of a familiar rumbling on my insides, a foreboding like an approaching storm. It was mounting anxiety as I strained to hear signs of similar distress coming from Sunny's gut, praying his would shortly become more intolerable than my own. It was grave concern for a sphincter fast approaching its limits. The tension of sitting on a powder keg about to blow without knowing when. It was futile resistance to a truth that could no longer be ignored. This was not going to end well. I don't remember who finally gave in. What I do remember is that as far as Sunny and I were concerned, our little felucca couldn't get to shore fast enough. The proud white sail, hearkening back to another time, now became a disturbing reminder we were almost out of it. I would have given anything to dispense with tradition and throw the engine into full throttle. But there wasn't a throttle, or even an engine. So, our reunion with dry land happened in torturous slow motion. My innards a bubbling cauldron, my sphincter a gasket about to blow. Scarcely had we touched sand than Sunny and I were off the boat, each scrambling in different directions in search of some privacy. We had stopped in a wild area of small dunes and clumps of tall grasses. There was no agriculture, no dwellings. My feet were buffered by the soft ground, but there was still the inevitable impact each time they fell upon it. I had only run a short distance when I knew I was in trouble. I'd been on the verge for too long. It was a miracle my body had withstood the pressure for as long as it had, deluding myself into thinking I could do so while running, no matter how short the distance, was a dire miscalculation. As I desperately scanned the environs for a place to relieve myself, my foot came down on the sand just a little too hard. That was all it took. My sphincter lost its grip, and I lost my race against time. And that's not the whole story, but that gives you an idea. So the next story I'm going to read, the next excerpt, are you saying? No? Okay, Linda's just having some emotions over there. Okay. Okay, so sometimes the stories are along those lines, like I said, kind of what you might expect. Sometimes they're just in the collection because a bathroom almost sort of makes a cameo, and the real story is about something else. Whether a predicament that I found myself in, or a weird relationship I might have had with someone when I'm traveling, or other things. So this is a flashback to one of those stories. It's a really, really short excerpt. And there actually is, I didn't realize this until I was coming to this. Oh wait, there is a bathroom in this story, but that's actually just by chance. The story itself is not related to that at all. So this is from, what's this one from? Falling to Pieces. This is from Falling to Pieces. A friend had purchased a condo, and she needed someone to drive down some things for the new place. She would bring a second load in a separate car the next day. Never having been to Palm Springs, I was more than happy to do her the favor, especially since I was getting a free trip out of the deal. After a 7-hour drive from San Francisco, I easily found the condo, located in a stucco-covered 70s-era complex, an all-too familiar agglomeration of uninspired cream-colored boxes and labyrinthine parking lots. I let myself in and headed to the bathroom. Turning on the light, I discovered roach carcasses littering the tub and sink. I took the fact that they were all dead, and seemed to have been for quite a while, as a sign the apartment had been treated by exterminators and hoped for the best. Nearly midnight, I got settled in the apartment, unrolled my sleeping bag on the floor, and turned out the lights. I was exhausted. The floor was hard, but lying down and stretching out felt good. As I drifted off to sleep, I heard the faint sound of a television in a neighboring unit. I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from exactly. Most likely, it was from downstairs. The more I listened, in spite of myself, the more I began to question what I heard. The sound seemed vaguely electronic, but I gradually became less certain they were coming from a television after all. I felt something on my head, mussing my hair as though I had mistaken depilatory cream for shampoo and had to rinse it out before every follicle was burnt from my head. I jumped up and turned on the light. A large roach was scrambling across the floor. No furnishings to afford it any cover, I saw the filth-loving creature in all its vile glory. Jagged legs, useless folded wings, and long, probing antennae. It hadn't been a TV. It had been a roach on my head. So close, I heard its peculiar mumbling. Who even knew that roaches mumbled? I rolled up my sleeping bag and went to find a hotel. Okay, the next story I'm going to read is from when I was living in Turkey. And as I said in the video, which you may or may not, I guess you could hear okay, but I don't know if this is a funny story, but hopefully it's an entertaining one, and I guess you can be the judge of that. Again, this is an excerpt, and this story is called A Real Shortage. I'm gonna get a little water.
There's no bathroom nearby.
There's no bathroom. That's okay, I have my water bottle. That story is No Stopping. California, I think it's No Stopping, is that right? Yeah. Okay. No, it's not No Stopping, it's Let It Flow. That story, the water bottle story is Let It Flow. Okay, this is from A Real Shortage. California was not the first place I experienced a water shortage. In fact, compared to what I lived on a daily basis in Istanbul, it's not even fair to say I experienced a water shortage in San Francisco. We knew there was a drought, so we tried to save water. I watered my garden less, I replaced plants that died with succulents, I stopped taking baths. Perhaps most important, if it was yellow, I let it mellow. And yet water always rained down from the shower head. Even when the drought at its most severe, we were shocked day after day by pictures of reservoirs turned to deserts, of impossibly dry, riddled earth riddled with painful cracks, lifeless where ordinarily there would be glittering blue. Water miraculously flowed from the tap. Not so when I lived in Turkey. I was just out of college. My stay in Istanbul had been made possible by the sale of my old Nissan Sentra hatchback. Given my intention to live in Turkey for at least a year, I couldn't survive on those proceeds, the sum total of my life savings, alone. Hence the teaching job I'd gotten when I arrived. It paid the local hourly rate. It wasn't some lucrative gig like those Japanese ones where young teachers are offered high-paying contracts with most of their expenses covered. I wasn't even certified to teach. Given my limited resources, I had no illusions of living in luxury, but I did care about location, and I was eager to put an end to a string of temporary housing situations. So, when I heard about a room in the city center, I asked my Turkish friend Neşe to go with me to see it. An attractive, good-natured woman in her mid-20s, a few years older than I was at the time, she managed the school where I was teaching. The flat with the room was in the middle of everything. Taksim Square, the de facto center of the city, its very heart, was a 5-minute walk away. When the tanks rolled in, as indeed they would, I'd be one of the first to see them. I'd never miss a single tear gas-filled protest. İstiklal Caddesi, Istanbul's main pedestrian street, was even closer. Cafes, bars and restaurants, cinemas, bookstores, and cultural centers. Little could I have known, but just steps from my apartment, I'd soon be participating in a French literary circle, and even learning Kurdish dance, and taking guitar lessons, in Turkish, at the Kurdish Association. Everything I could possibly need for both expanding my cultural horizons and finding myself a political prisoner would be right at my doorstep. The Turks and Kurds, after all, had long been engaged in a messy civil war in the country's southeast. If I went the other direction, if I wanted to breathe comparatively fresh air and feel an invigorating sea breeze, if I wanted to watch oil tankers dwarfing everything they passed on their way to and from the Sea of Marmara, I could walk down the long, steep hill to the Bosphorus. I could even walk to work if I wasn't in a hurry and felt up to a little exercise. It was perfect. A short, plump, animated landlady in her 70s welcomed us. Her flat was in a historic old building built by a pasha, a high-ranking Ottoman official. Or so she said. Of course, it very well might have been true, but even if it was, the building's glory days had long since passed. No one of any means lived there now. It was to make ends meet that the landlady rented out 3 of her rooms. She showed us the one that was available. There was nothing to it. A single bed with a lumpy mattress. Yellowing wallpaper with a forgettable floral pattern creeping up from the floor. Unusually high ceilings and an unusually tall window overlooking the alley a few stories below. There was also a simple nightstand and an electric space heater. Essential, since the apartment didn't have central heat and it was the middle of winter. After a quick look at the bedroom, the landlady, Ayten, escorted Neşe and me back to the living room. Over little glasses of the ubiquitous Black Sea black tea, as much a part of Turkish culture as donors and kebabs, we got acquainted and discussed the apartment. Things seemed to be going well until out of the blue, Neşe frowned. The conversation was taking place in Turkish, which I hardly spoke. Matthew, Neşe began, turning to me. There's no th sound in Turkish. Like so many English speakers hopelessly unable to roll their R's, the vast majority of Turks couldn't pronounce th if it meant a lifetime supply of Turkish delight. Consequently, for the year I lived in Istanbul, I ceased to be Matthew. Instead, I became Matthew. She is trying to ask a higher price, Neşe explained. Oh, I said. I should have been alarmed, maybe even angered. I wasn't. Perhaps I was too overwhelmed by my sense of déjà vu. During a previous interview for a prospective roommate situation, the renter, a peculiar, unstable 20-something, had doodled nonstop while we talked. When she looked away, I glanced at her paper. It was covered in dollar signs. She sees you're a foreigner, Neşe said. She thinks you have money. If I had money, would I really want to rent a tiny room in a dilapidated old building with roommates I've never met? She knows I'm working for you, right? I mean, I'm grateful for the job and everything, but it's not like I'm doing it just for fun. I promise there's no trust fund. I know, Neşe laughed. I will explain to her that you are not a rich American. Neşe and Ayten had another brief exchange. We quickly settled on a price, somewhere between the original and the screw the foreigner one. I moved in, I showed up with my backpack, a couple of days later. Okay, and the last story I'm going to read is another quick flashback, and this one takes place in San Francisco, but actually I think I say that in the story, so this is another one I don't really need to introduce. And this is from Strangers in the Night. My friend Sophie had just arrived from France, and we were relaxing over a couple of glasses of wine. The apartment was lit by the soft glow of candlelight. One glass down, Sophie excused herself to go to the bathroom. Since I lived in a small studio, I turned up the music to give her some privacy. Sophie had long struggled with debilitating flatulence, and as I myself knew all too well, prolonged periods in pressurized cabins only made it that much worse. The toilet flushed, and Sophie screamed. As I jumped to my feet to rush to her aid, she jumped out of the bathroom, enveloped in a noxious odor. Despite some memorable movements of my own, I'd never smelled anything like it. Not fried onions, not roasted garlic. Even when I was a carnivore, not the lowest quality of beef. Nothing I'd ever eaten had resulted in such an unbearable stench. It was like a rancid sort of death. "My air caught on fire!" she exclaimed, still in a panic. Sophie's hair was, or had been, a couple of inches shy of shoulder length. For whatever reason, she had bent down at the sink, and her hair had fallen into a candle, burning next to it. That explained the sickening smell. Burnt hair. "How'd you put it out?" I asked, still alarmed, looking her up and down as though fearing a spark might reignite, turning her into a fireball. "With my hands," she replied. "I didn't even think about it. When I looked in the mirror and saw the flames, I just grabbed at them." I understood her reaction. In high school chemistry class, my sweater sleeve had dangled for just a little too long over the transparent flame of a Bunsen burner. When my arm caught fire, my reflexive response, just like Sophie's moments before, had been to snuff out the flames with my bare hand. Surprisingly, it proved no worse for the wear. I couldn't help but think I'd be a natural at firewalking. As for Sophie's hair, it had always been a tangled, split-ended disaster. I'd seen more orderly rat's nests. Perhaps burning some of it off was for the best, like scorching a field so it can lay fallow, setting the stage for a period of renewal. I pondered a delicate way of suggesting Sophie ride the momentum and take it one step further, shaving her head and making a fresh start. If she was ashamed of having set herself on fire, she could just say she caught a nasty case of lice. Thank you. Alright, so I was going to show some pictures. I don't think I'm going to show the pictures, so the last thing I'll do, and then we can have some questions or not, depending on whether you have questions, is just talk about the cover, because people ask about covers all the time, and I always like to know about other people's covers. So I broke my own rule with this cover, is I always tell everyone, don't design your own covers, because most of us don't have, it's an art, right? It really is an art, and we see so many that look amateurish, and the person thinks they look great, and it's like, well, I have the gauging, and so that gives me an advantage with design. And so I decided, to publish this on relatively short notice, and finding someone to design it was going to be kind of tricky, and so I thought, it was late one night, and I had a vision for what I wanted the cover to look like. I had Arnold, he's the duck, he's right there, and so I had the vision, and I went online and I found this picture, and they're not colors I would normally go for because they're so sort of abrasive. But then I thought, the objective here is actually to get attention. And so I designed the cover, and I sent it to a few friends, again, including Chuck. So if you don't like the cover, talk to Chuck. And they didn't all like it, but they all thought it didn't look amateurish, that it looked professional enough. And so I just went with it. So that's the cover. And this is Arnold actually in my toilet, and I just photoshopped the toilet away from Arnold. So that's an introduction to my book, Porcelain Travels. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? All right, I'm not seeing any questions. All right, thank you. Oh, Erin is thinking she might have a question. Okay, there's rumination going on. Okay.
Yeah, I want to know what happened in
Talia has a question.
I want to know what happened in Egypt.
Well, the book is available right up there at the cash register.
What was the question?
Well, she wants to know what happened in Egypt, so I don't know how to tell the story without... she did buy the book, so in that sense she had... okay, so I guess... Read a little more from that story. I don't know that we have...
Just a little more. One more page.
Well, I didn't read any... Wait, which... Do you want to know about the Egypt story that I read from?
Yeah.
I shat myself. I mean, it's pretty clear that that's where that was going, right?
I want to hear it literally.
You want to hear it literally?
Just read it a little. We'll read it at home.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that one, I'm trying to be selective about how far I went with that. Linda. Oh, she's holding the book.
I just want to mention two stories that I think are so unbelievable.
2 stories that she thinks are so unbelievably something. Funny.
On the bin and the bomb.
The Bin and the Bomb, that's the French one.
I have been there, but not quite in the way you were there. I mean.
I was going to show pictures of that. I have pictures of that.
Extreme. And then the other one was No Refuge.
No Refuge.
Terrible. When you thought you were going to a writer's refuge, and in fact, you had become a slave.
Yes. So I thought that I was going to do a work trade situation in the south of France. I had been, again, I know I alluded to some of this, I can't remember how much I said. I was in Paris and I was running out of money, but I was getting a lot of work done on my writing, so I didn't want to come back yet. And so I thought I need to get creative, so I went online and I found this ostensibly a work trade situation. And so I went down to this farm in the south of France, and it was this couple, and they were renovating this really old, 15th century or 16th century farm, and they needed help. In exchange, I was going to get a place and food, room and board, and time to work on my writing. Well, they gave me no time to work on my writing, and it really became, there was no trade. It was basically, like Linda just said, slave labor. And so there are 2 stories in this book that are sort of collections of stories within the collection, and that's one of them. But the cool thing about that one, though, is I ended up being able to go back online. So this happened years ago, and I was able to find a postscript, and it involves Interpol and the French police, and they ended up getting shut down, and there was quite a dramatic postscript to that. So that was cool to be able to find that, because I had looked over the course of the years to see if I could ever find out what happened, and I never found anything until I finished this book. So, thank you, Diane.
And I ordered your book, and it's, with Amazon, as you suggested.
You don't want to say that here. You don't want to say that here. You ordered it through Book Passage, and you were saying?
I don't have it yet, but your story about wet feet and urinals.
Wet feet and urinals. So I was in Eastern Europe, I think, someplace in Eastern Europe. I can't even remember where because it happened so long ago. And I don't know how to tell this story without. Well, that's the story that I heard some laughter where I said I was peeing and I thought and then it turns out that not everything is what it seems. And I needed to stop peeing, but of course at that point it was too late because of this situation. But I don't know how to tell more than that without divulging. Some of you heard me read that one at Weekday Wanderlust. So some of you already know the answer to that one. Thank you. Erin.
I wanted to
She's holding the book too.
I wanted to mention your Turkish bath in Morocco story because you're going to read it at our events. But your Monsieur is so, I don't know, I read it the other day and I could not stop laughing.
Thank you. Thank you. That was the experience that I referred to in the video as it's funny to look back on now, but it was not funny at all while I was living it. I know Mike has had wait, didn't you write one about Morocco?
Yeah,
no,
did.
Hudson.
Not about a bath.
It's
No,
always
Hudson
shocking.
wrote
It's
about
always
that.
shocking to go
In
to a
Hidden Palace.
hammam.
Yeah.
I mean,
What's
it's
that?
always shocking to go to a hammam. Like, it's always startling, but you really capture the
Really captured. Thank you.
sense of
Well, the whole premise of that story was I lived in Istanbul for a year, as I think again I mentioned, and I never went to Turkish bath. And so Turkish bath in Morocco is I go to Morocco and I have this opportunity to right this horrible wrong, and I end up a bloody mess, quite frankly, literally.
it's awesome.
Thank you. Sabine, in back.
Yeah. So how many stories were in the original email that you sent out to friends, and was it difficult to find others to add on to that, or did you get started and then all of a sudden you found tons?
No, it was really easy. I had tons. Yeah. Seriously, that was easy. And the original stories, I were just like 4 or 5. You know, the original was just 4 or 5, and there ended up being 25 in the final collection. And I just had an experience in Uzbekistan that I really wanted to include. And you know, before I went to Uzbekistan, so I was in Uzbekistan in the stands for a month in April and May, as a lot of you already know. And people were joking before I went, oh, so that's great, you'll get a whole bunch more bathroom experiences. And I was like, I'm done thinking about bathrooms. I don't want more bathroom experiences. Well, in Uzbekistan, I had a story that is going to be story number 26 in edition 2, but it was bad. It was bad. Yeah.
Matthew, you've written all these stories and you sent them to friends and all that sort of thing. You come back and you're going to put your book together. What percentage of the editing was there to get it to your book now?
You would need to ask your wife, because she did a lot of that editing.
No, you did.
No, I didn't really do that
did the
much.
work.
There really wasn't. I mean, it was more like reworking and smoothing things out. I didn't really.
They were good.
Thank you very much. Yeah, there wasn't a massive. Yeah. unlike my novel, where half of it ended up on the, literally half of it ended up, you know, on the drawing, whatever, the cutting room floor, I think that's the expression. You must be a writer. Metaphors I always really struggle with. But yeah, with this one it wasn't that much.
How did you combine what you call your B readers with your editors?
Beta readers, yeah.
If they disagree, why B? What B means like A, B?
It's a technical, it's an IT thing. When you want to have people test like a new software, then you have your beta testers because it's not ready for the real world and you want to get the feedback before it's ready for the real world, so I'm just, I know. So no, I think that with regards to process, I think that ultimately, you know, my first book is about your intuition. I think ultimately you have to go with your gut. So Linda's input, obviously, I'm going to hold in the highest esteem, but that doesn't mean I'm going to take every single one of her comments because ultimately it's still my voice, it's still how I want to tell the story. And maybe Chuck has a comment that, you know, that just feels more in line with, I mean, I still took, you know, 99% of the comments, of course, and feedback. But no, I think you just have to go with, you take it in, and then ultimately it's your work, it's your judgment call, and you kind of go with that, I think. Gerald.
Matt, sort of on the same line then, so how do you structure the stories over that amount of time? How do you decide how to tell the story in a book? How do you prioritize?
You mean how do you organize the overall collection or individual stories? The overall collection.
Going through to get there.
So the overall collection, organizing it, I don't know, seriously, you'll have to tell me whether I was successful, because that was really hard, because I didn't want to just do it chronologically, I didn't want to do it just geographically. So what I did, I would kind of have to actually look at it, figure out how I did it, because I went through so many iterations, and I did try to make, like I would look at the end of a story and see how it might dovetail into the beginning of the next one. I did a little bit of that just for sort of organic flow in that sense. I tried to vary, so you know, I wasn't going to put the two really long collections together, so I would kind of vary in length. I would vary in mood also, like I didn't want to put the ones that I thought were more outlandishly funny in the beginning and then have the more entertaining, you know, so I tried to vary mood, length, that kind of thing, and then still have the ends dovetail more or less with the beginnings, but yeah, it's not an exact science, and so, Tanya.
What's next?
What's next? So I started writing 2 books. So one is sort of a spiritual memoir / travel book that takes place on Mallorca when I was finishing my novel. And I just had over-the-top synchronicities, dreams, I had premonitions, but then I was also in this just incredibly beautiful place and had some incredible travel story experiences. So there's that. So that's one I've already written 15,000 words of. And then I wasn't going to write about Central Asia, but then I had some great things happen in Central Asia, and so I think that might be another one like my Morocco book that's fairly short. It's not a big, but some of the stories that happened were just so special and so insightful and interesting that I kind of want to write those stories, which again I wanted to go to Central Asia just to have an adventure and not write and really just have that experience. It wasn't about writing. But then I had some experiences that I feel like writing about now. Nahid.
Yes. So you may have already went over that.
If I do it, I won't go over it again.
Yeah,
so let's hope not.
So anyway, so we all probably all of us have had an experience where like you're frantically looking for a bathroom and you can't find one. So but I guess my question is, how did you decide to so funny and eloquently turn that experience into a story that I heard the first story in Lit Crawl or at Lit Crawl, and I can't wait to read the rest,
Thank you.
So what was the spark for your first bathroom or bathhouse story?
Well, one of the reasons, first of all, there are no bathhouse stories, don't worry about that. That's a different collection coming out. Yeah. Well, that's a Turkish bath in Morocco. Like I said, I ended up a bloody mess. But that's actually a great question, because that's one of the reasons I didn't want to write, or I was resistant to writing this book initially, and like I said, because humor is really hard to do, and it's one thing to be maybe witty in a conversation, it's another to be funny on the page. And so people were saying, oh, you should write, and I'm like, I don't know that I can be funny on the page, I don't know about that. But the reason I hesitated, but then some of the stories were just so funny in and of themselves that I didn't have to be funny because it was truth, truth is stranger than fiction sort of stuff. And so I didn't have to try to be funny necessarily. I wanted to write a good story, but the events are what created the humorous situations, one. But then two, like I said, when I went back to these original stories, I didn't think they were that funny. And so it was only because I realized that I had grown as a writer that now I felt up to that challenge. But even then I wasn't sure. And the thing that made me really comfortable, and this is interesting just to learn about myself, is I've read these stories like 10,000 times, every one of them, right? And I will still laugh. And I'm the most critical person of myself and of my writing. So if I'm laughing, then I know that at least somebody's going to think they're at least mildly amusing. And so that was kind of the barometer. It's like, you know what? I'm now laughing at these, whereas initially I kind of wasn't. And like I said, I don't think they're all laugh out loud funny. That's because I also don't want to put that pressure on that you're going to be in hysterics in every story. So I think I just gave you 5 answers to that question, but that's actually a really good question. Bill, and then Tanya.
I have a comment and a question.
Yeah.
I know you're a great interviewer from your show, but I just wanted to say that's the best bathroom self-interview I've ever seen.
Look,
on your video.
How many have you seen?
On your video.
Oh, this one that we were looking at?
Yeah.
Thank you,
Yeah.
thank you. Have you seen others?
No.
Yeah, okay. I think I might have the corn on the market on that one. But thank you.
But I'm worried about electrocution the whole time I was watching.
I actually worried about electrocution because I had the camera mounted. So that took 2 days, 3 different brands of bubble bath because the bubbles would not stay bubbly. And and I had my lighting set up and I had my camera. I should have had you there because he's the professional cinematographer and film guy.
I not want to be there.
But I could have worn a bathing suit. But no, so I had the camera. These. I was gonna bring it up here. They have these really cool camera mounts where you have like the spider legs things. So I had that on the spigot of my tub.
Oh
and so it was over the water, and I just kept making sure it was really tight and just kind of in this, if I have to jump, having an emergency, and I practiced my emergency evacuation before I started doing it. But that was actually a real concern. Water and electricity do not go well together.
An emergency evacuation wasn't a concern?
What's that?
Emergency evacuation wasn't a concern?
Well, that's chapter 14. That's chapter 14. Yeah.
And my question is, what are you wearing?
I'm wearing a robe that I bought today at Target, especially for today. And then I'm wearing underwear. Just in case.
It's really becoming, I think you should wear it for the rest of the season.
You think I should keep wearing it?
Oh, yeah.
Every week.
Yes.
The texture. It's not actually terry cloth, it's just, like I said, it's Target. It was $30 though, which is more than I thought I was gonna have to pay for a cheap robe. But you know what? For my art. For my art. Alright, I feel like Linda is getting ready to take the cane and pull me off. Are we done?
I think you did a great job.
Thank you.
Everybody.
Thank you. And thanks again for bearing with the technical issues, and thank you very much for coming out, especially with another